A wave of intense religious revivalism that swept the U.S. during the 1820s and 30s led to the formation of a number of prohibition movements driven by religious groups who considered alcohol a national curse. The first temperance legislation appeared in 1838 in the form of a Massachusetts law prohibiting the sale of spirits in less than 15-gallon quantities. Although it was repealed 2 years later, Maine passed the first state prohibition law in 1846, and by the time the Civil War began, a number of other states had followed suit. As early as 1873, the Women's Christian Temperance Union of Ohio called for the abolition of the sale of alcohol. They were soon joined in the fight by even more powerful Anti-Saloon League, founded in 1893 in Ohio, but later expanded into a national organization that endorsed political candidates and lobbied for legislation against saloons. Beginning around 1906, the ASL led a renewed call for prohibition legislation at the state level. Through speeches, advertisements, and public demonstrations at saloons and bars, prohibition advocates attempted to convince people that the eliminating alcohol from society would eliminate poverty and social vices, such as immoral behavior and physical violence. One prominent temperance advocate, Kentucky-born Carrie Amelia Moore Nation, she called herself Carrie A. Nation, became known for particularly violent tactics against what she called evil spirits. In addition to making protest speeches, Nation was known for breaking saloon windows and mirrors and destroying kegs of beer or whiskey with a hatchet. She was arrested numerous times and became a household name across the country for her saloon smashing campaign. By 1916, 23 of 48 states had passed anti-saloon legislation. Many went further, prohibiting the manufacture of alcoholic beverages as well. After the congressional elections that year, dry members, those who favored a national prohibition of alcohol, they wanted 2/3 majority over wet in the U.S. Congress. On January 16, 1919, the requisite number of states ratified the 18th Amendment, which prohibited the manufacturing, transportation, and sale of alcohol within the United States. It would go into effect the following January. Almost all progressive reformers felt that the growing numbers of immigrants was causing social problems. New theories argued that immigration was polluting American racial stock and culture. One of these theories was known as eugenics. Eugenics was the science of altering the reproductive process of plants and animals to produce new breeds. This was being applied to humans through forced sterilizations and other methods that attempted to limit the procreation of certain groups. Since the early 1890s, Congress had been seeking sufficient consensus and support to enact immigration restrictions that would decrease immigration from Europe. Repeated failures led to the authorization of this high-level commission in 1907 to research the causes and impact of recent immigration, which had been increasing in numbers. Immigration had been surging since the 1880s and was largely comprised of Eastern and Southern Europeans, such as Italians, Armenians, and Poles, who settled in urban centers rather than the English, German, and French associated with the early republic. Drawing on the eugenics beliefs in racial hierarchies and extensive qualitative studies, the Dillingham Commission sought to scientifically demonstrate that Eastern and Southern Europeans were not assimilating and degrading the quality of U.S. society and civilization. Echoing the recommendations of the Immigration Restriction League, the Dillingham Commission issued a 41-volume report and recommended literacy tests as the means to reduce immigrant numbers by turning away low-quality persons. Some progressive reformers deemed capitalism only beneficial to the rich and turned to alternative economic theories. Eugene V. Debs was a labor organizer that became president of the American Railway Union. He favored unions organized by industry. He gained notoriety when he successfully organized a strike against the Great Northern Railway in 1894. He was later jailed for his role in leading the Pullman strike 1 year later. While in prison, he read numerous books by Karl Marx. Debs saw the labor movement as a struggle between classes and established the Socialist Party of America in 1897. He ran for president in 1900, 1904, 1908, 1912, and again in 1920, each time with more votes. In 1905, he was a founding member of the Industrial Workers of the World, but left due to their radical beliefs. The IWW was a revolutionary organization that rejected the American Federation of Labor's acceptance of capitalism. They attempted to control the means of production by the workers. Their tactics often led to arrests and were very successful in the mining and lumbering industries of the Pacific Northwest. It was the only labor organization to oppose U.S. participation in World War I and was attacked by the federal government because of it. Overall, the ideals of socialism appealed to the progressives. It was very strongly supported in urban communities. Though they believed in varying methods, overall, progressives sought peaceful change to our economic systems through political struggle. Although, due to its pacifist nature and opposition to World War I involvement, it was severely weakened by the war and lost a lot of support. Theodore Roosevelt is considered by most historians as the first modern president. He came into office following the assassination of William McKinley, a fairly popular expansion-minded president. Roosevelt promised the American people a square deal and became the leader of the progressive reform. It all started in 1902 when the United Mine Workers of America went on strike, pushing for higher wages, shorter workdays, and union recognition. The strike threatened to shut down the winter fuel supply to major American cities. Roosevelt intervened, pushing the owners to negotiate. The miners received a 10% wage increase and reduced workday from 10 to 9 hours. The owners got a higher price for coal and refused to recognize the union. Although Roosevelt was known as a trust buster, his ultimate goal was not the destruction of big business, but its regulation. For Roosevelt, the concentration of industry in fewer hands represented not just a threat to fair markets, but also to democracy, as wealthy industrialists consolidated power in their own hands. He turned to the Sherman Antitrust Act to challenge business monopolies, bringing suit against the Northern Securities Company in 1902. The Justice Department initiated 42 additional antitrust cases during his presidency, including one against the Standard Oil Company and the American Tobacco Company. During Roosevelt's second term, regulating business became increasingly important. Roosevelt had always believed big business was an inevitable economic development. Regulation was a means to level the playing field and provide a square deal to citizens, as Roosevelt had promised in his re-election campaign. He supported laws like the 1906 Hepburn Act, which regulated the railroads, and the same year's Pure Food and Drug and Meat Inspection Act, which controlled the drug and food industry. Roosevelt was a passionate conservationist and pushed Congress to pass legislation to protect the natural beauty of the U.S. The Forest Reserve Act allowed the president to set aside over 150 million acres of land as national forests. It also protected watersheds from the erosion and flooding. The Antiquities Act was the first law to promote protection for any general kind of cultural or natural resource. It allows the president to protect historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, and other objects of historic or scientific interest. Some examples of protected sites include Devil's Tower in Wyoming, the Petrified Forest in Arizona, Muir Woods in California, and the Grand Canyon in Arizona. The Newlands Reclamation Act funded irrigation projects for the arid lands of 20 states in the West. Without this project, much of the West could not have been settled by Americans. Finally, the National Conservation Commission, led by Gifford Pinchot, managed the nation's natural resources in an effort to promote conservation. The Panic of 1907 was the first worldwide financial crisis of the 20th century. It was caused by stock manipulation scheme to gain significant control of the United Copper Company. When this failed, the banks that lent the money to the scheme suffered numerous bank runs, which spread, culminating in the failure of the third largest trust in New York City, the Knickerbocker Trust Company. A bank run is when large groups of people pull their money out of a bank at once, depleting the supply of money and causing it to fail. Failure of this trust spread fear throughout the country as many people began to withdraw money from banks. J.P. Morgan, a wealthy financier, pledged large sums of his own money to strengthen the banking system, ending the panic. This financial crisis led the U.S. government to investigate the crisis and ultimately would lead to the creation of the Federal Reserve System. Theodore Roosevelt chose not to seek re-election in 1908 and promoted close friend William Howard Taft as his successor. Taft wasn't really interested in becoming president. He wanted to be on the Supreme Court. Reluctantly, he decided to run. It was generally expected that Taft would be Roosevelt's man in the White House, and Taft himself vowed to continue Roosevelt's progressive policies. Taft's approach to progressive reform differed from his predecessor. Unlike Roosevelt, he preferred to go through Congress to enact progressive reform instead of executive orders. In 1910, Congress passed the Mann-Elkins Act, which extended the Interstate Commerce Act and the authority of the Interstate Commerce Commission to set railroad rates and regulate the telecommunications industry. Taft alienated many liberal Republicans, who would later form the Progressive Party, by defending the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act. This law actually raised tariff rates, which was strongly opposed by progressives in the party. Taft promised to continue Roosevelt's work as a conservationist. The United States Bureau of Mines was established in 1910 by the Department of the Interior. The Bureau was established to promote health and safety, conserve material resources, increase efficiency, and promote economic development in the mining industry. Taft's Secretary of the Interior, Bollinger, opened public lands in Alaska for private development. He was criticized by the Chief of the Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot. Taft stood by Bollinger and fired Pinchot. Conservatives applauded Taft while progressives protested. This would lead to the split in the Republican Party. Taft also believed in protecting children. The Federal Children's Bureau was the first federal agency within the U.S. government to focus exclusively on the lives of children and families. Between 1915 and 1930, the Children's Bureau published 31 studies examining the working conditions of child laborers across the country. These studies helped to reveal the nature of child labor in the U.S. and would eventually lead to congressional legislation. In the realm of labor, Taft established the Department of Labor in 1913 as an executive-level cabinet department. The purpose of the Department of Labor was to promote and develop the well-being of workers across the U.S. by improving working conditions and advancing opportunities for profitable employment. Taft was also able to guarantee government employees an 8-hour workday. The Republicans were divided into the conservative Old Guard, led by Cannon, and the progressives, led by President Theodore Roosevelt. His committee assignment privileges ensured that the party's progressive element was essentially powerless in the House, and its control over the legislative process obstructed progressive legislation. After 4 years in the White House, Taft agreed to run for a second term, mainly because he felt compelled to defend himself against Roosevelt's attack on him as a traitor to reform. His former friends and allies had become bitter opponents. Roosevelt saw Taft as betraying his promise to advance Roosevelt's agenda. He was especially bitter over Taft's antitrust policy, which had targeted one of Roosevelt's personally sanctioned good trusts, U.S. Steel. The former president also felt personally betrayed by Taft's firing of Gifford Pinchot, the head of the U.S. Forest Service, and Roosevelt's old friend and conservation policy ally. Certain that Taft would take the party down with him in 1912, Roosevelt was determined to replace him as the 1912 Republican candidate. Roosevelt won most of the primary elections in 1912, but Taft won the delegates in states that held conventions. Taft won the Republican Party nomination, forcing Roosevelt to leave the party. After his return to America in 1910 from a big game hunting safari in Africa and a European tour, Roosevelt began to criticize Taft in speeches which sketched out his new nationalism policies. He argued for the elimination of special interests from politics, direct primaries, and a graduated income and inheritance taxes. Roosevelt's platform also advocated a downward revision of the tariff schedule, open publicity about corporate business practices and decisions, and laws prohibiting the use of corporate funds in politics. Additionally, he supported the initiative and referendum process, as well as the conservation and use of natural resources to benefit all people. Having lost the Republican nomination, Roosevelt formed the Progressive Party. It was nicknamed the Bull Moose Party in honor of Roosevelt's comparison of himself to a raging bull moose ready for a fight. The new party nominated Roosevelt as its presidential candidate on August 6th in Chicago. The progressive governor of California, Hiram Johnson, was selected as Roosevelt's running mate. The Democrats nominated Woodrow Wilson, the progressive governor of New Jersey, as their candidate in 1912. In the campaign that followed, Taft became more conservative as he ran against two challengers, both identified as progressives. Meanwhile, Roosevelt and Wilson slugged it out in the popular media. Wilson presented his New Freedom ideas, which were very similar to Roosevelt's New Nationalism, except Wilson favored the dismantling of all giant monopolies. Roosevelt visited 34 states and won significant public sympathy from an attempted assassin's attack in Milwaukee. After being shot in the chest, the healthy bull moose survived to make a scheduled campaign appearance. The bullet had entered his chest, but had been deflected from its full force by a 50-page speech in Roosevelt's coat pocket. On Election Day, Wilson beat the split Republicans decisively in the Electoral College. Taft carried only two minor states, Utah and Vermont. Wilson compiled 435 electoral votes to 88 for Roosevelt and 8 for Taft. Without Roosevelt's interference, the Republicans would have won the election, as Taft and Roosevelt had a larger combined popular vote than Wilson. Moreover, when the Roosevelt, Wilson, and Debs votes are combined, the election of 1912 represents a stunning victory for progressivism or reform at the national level. Taft's policies had been decisively rejected by the end of his term. Wilson's progressive ideology was known as New Freedom. His platform pledged to restore opportunities for everyday Americans and use the power of the federal government to achieve social justice for all. New Freedom sought to achieve this vision by attacking what Wilson called the triple wall of privilege: the tariff, the banks, and the trusts. Tariffs protected the large industrialists at the expense of small farmers. Wilson signed the Underwood-Simmons Act into law in 1913, which reduced tariff rates. The banking system also pinched small farmers and entrepreneurs. The gold standard still made currency too tight, and loans were too expensive for the average American. Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act, which made the nation's currency more flexible. Unlike Roosevelt, Wilson did not distinguish between good trusts and bad trusts. Any trust by virtue of its large size was bad in Wilson's eyes. The Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 clarified the Sherman Act by specifically naming certain business tactics as illegal. This same act also exempted labor unions from antitrust lawsuits and declared strikes, boycotts, and peaceful picketing perfectly legal. He also created the Federal Trade Commission to watch over corporations, ensuring fair competition and proper advertising. Wilson also sought to enact social change with his new freedom. The 1900 census revealed that about 2 million children were working in mills, mines, fields, factories, stores, and on city streets across the U.S. This report sparked a national movement to end child labor, which led to the passage of the first child labor bill, the Keating-Owen Act of 1916. The act banned the sale of products from any factory or shop that employed children under the age of 14, or from any mine that employed children under the age of 16. Unfortunately, it was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court because it overstepped the government's regulation of interstate commerce. Like Roosevelt, Wilson was a conservationist that wanted to continue the protection of the natural beauty of the U.S. The National Park Service Organic Act established the National Park Service to administer the national parks and monuments throughout the country. As the temperance movement gained momentum, there was significant political pressure to pass prohibition. The 18th Amendment, passed in 1917 and ratified in 1919, bans the manufacture, sale, and distribution of alcohol. Congress passed the Volstead Act to provide for the federal enforcement of prohibition. In the realm of politics, the 17th Amendment provided for the direct election of U.S. senators, a reform proposed back in the populist era of the late 19th century to eliminate political corruption. Finally, the 19th Amendment, as mentioned earlier, granted women the right to vote.